Hello, my name is Maciej Blaszyk, and this is Module 1 of the Summerhill Online Academy IELTS Academic Writing Preparation course hosted by Efficient English. This is Module 1 of the Summerhill Online Academy Writing Task 1, and it will focus on the increases and decreases type Writing Task 1 questions. This module is split into 3 parts. So in the first part, we're going to talk about the general method for writing IELTS Task 1 Academic. This is an important step as we will be coming back to this general method, this general approach for doing IELTS Task 1 Academic for all types of academic writing Task 1, including maps, pie charts, processes, and of course increases, decreases. We will also, in this module, take a look at some essential grammar forms, some essential sentence structures that we can use to describe trends. And in the final section of this Module 1, we are going to also look at some more challenging examples of writing Task 1 and look at some of the ways that we can apply the general methods to solve them. So let's begin first of all with the general approach. Now, I think it's very important to realize that for most of us, writing Task 1 may seem a little bit more challenging than even writing Task 2, the essay, because we are, generally speaking, not used to writing or describing graphs and charts in our daily lives. Yes, some of us are familiar with this when we use these for work or for scientific studies, but describing graphs and charts effectively becomes challenging even in your native language if you're not particularly used to it. What's more, most candidates, when they are given a writing Task 1, look at all these complicated graphs and charts and find the challenge quite daunting. It's very common for me to see a lot of candidates staring at the question for 5 solid minutes, just trying to figure out what the numbers represent and what the relationships between the different data described is before even writing the first word on the piece of paper. However, as we know, and we can see here, there's only 20 minutes. You only have 20 minutes for this task, and you have about 40 minutes for writing Task 2, and you're giving writing Task 1 and 2 together, and are expected to use those 60 minutes to write both responses. And you are responsible for managing that time yourself. And in reality, I have noticed that on many occasions, especially for the academic writing IELTS section, candidates will take more than 20 minutes to write IELTS Writing Task 1, which takes away from Writing Task 2, which is 250 words, unlike Writing Task 1, which is 150. So I find that this particular approach we're going to learn is really going to help us to cut down on the time, right? And basically, it's a 4-step method, and it's a 4-step method that can be used to solve any writing Task 1 academic for IELTS. And basically, the 4 steps are: Step 1, write a paraphrase. Step 2, divide the information. Step 3, describe the information. And number 4, write an overview. So we're going to take a look at these 4 steps and how they apply. So step number 1, as I mentioned before, looking at some of these academic writing Tasks 1, they can be quite complicated looking, and one of the first mistakes that candidates do is they look carefully at the graphs and the charts and the numbers, and they think. Well, the first step is not to think too much. And in fact, the first step is to focus on the paraphrase by ignoring the descriptive data below and just focusing on this one sentence that appears in the box. This is the only sentence in the writing task 1 question that changes. Everything like summarize the information by selecting and importing the main features and make comparisons where relevant. This will stay the same in all writing tasks 1. Okay, what will change is only the sentence. So step number 1 is ignore the actual graphs, charts, maps, anything that you see below. Ignore this because it will only serve to confuse you. The first step is just to look at the sentence and paraphrase this sentence. And this is actually quite easy. This is one of the least difficult tasks in IELTS, just paraphrasing the sentence. And you can very easily paraphrase by just changing the action word of the sentence. So in this sentence, the charts below represent average automobile repair costs and 5 major sources of repair costs in one North American town, right? Can be changed instead of the chart below represents, maybe shows, describes, illustrates, right? Then we can change the word charts to graphs, and we can be more specific and say a line chart or bar chart, pie chart. Again, line graph, bar graph, right? Describe them both. Then we can move on to bigger chunks of information, like if we want to paraphrase average automobile repair costs, perhaps we could rephrase it as the average cost of repairing automobiles, or perhaps the cost on average of repairing automobiles, right? And maybe 5 major sources of repair cost. That could be paraphrased as the main causes of repair cost and the most common sources of repair cost, right? But in essence, the first step is to rephrase or paraphrase this sentence. And a candidate which is given writing task 1 academic can do this immediately. It's a very important point to make here that not all parts of the sentence can be paraphrased. In fact, one North American town cannot be paraphrased at all, because when we think about one North American town, it's important to note that this could be a North American town anywhere in North America, including in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So we wouldn't want to say in North America or American town. That could sound more like the United States. You have to be a North American town. Let's see an example here. The line chart and pie chart show the average cost of repairing automobiles along with the main sources of automobile repair cost in a North American town. So we're just paraphrasing in this sentence. And we've got already 27 words. So we're expected to write 150 words. We've already wrote 27 words. So we're really on our way. And we can do this immediately without too much thinking, right? And again, just by creating this paraphrase, which should be the first paragraph of your writing task 1, we get, as candidates, a much clearer idea of what the data actually represents. So just by virtue of paraphrasing that sentence, you're able to start writing immediately, so you can produce the language immediately, and give yourself a much clearer idea of what you want to do. And as soon as you finish writing your paraphrase, right, it's time for step number 2. And in step number 2, we can now look more closely at the graph and the charts, the maps below, right? And for our second step, we're just going to divide the information. And what I mean is we're looking about what the different kinds of information we have. How are we going to organize the body paragraphs, right? And here we can see that there are 2 charts. One of them describes the average expenditure on car maintenance throughout a year. It's also important to note that there's no date here, as in a year. So we know this is a regular, annual thing, not a past event, not a future event. This is a present event. This is something that happens all the time, which gives us an important clue about what kind of grammar we're going to use. Okay, and we can see that the other chart shows the causes of repair costs, the sources of repair costs, and we can see which sources they are. So just by looking at these different charts and graphs, and sometimes you just have one chart with maybe 2 or 3 bars or lines, or maybe it's just even one pie chart with certain information on it. And but still, you'll need to divide the information. What are you going to talk about first? What are you going to talk about next? Are there any relationships, right? For example, in some graphs, you can see 3 lines, for example. This is taken from an actual IELTS writing task 1 from one of the Cambridge books, and we can see that there are 3 charts, three lines, one for USA, Sweden, Japan, but we can also see that the trend between the United States and Sweden seem to be quite similar. So we might spend just one paragraph talking about both USA and Sweden, and how just to show a relationship between these two countries and how similar the trends are, and maybe one paragraph talking just only about the trend in Japan, right? It's good to sort of plan. In this chart, we have 4 pie charts, and we can see that there are 4 pie charts. And we can see the sources of electricity in Australia in 1980 and 2000, and sources of electricity in France in 1980 and 2000. We could just spend talking about both Australia and France in 1980, or we end basically both Australia and France in the year 2000. Or we could spend one paragraph talking about just trends in Australia in 1980 and 2000, and maybe just the different trends in France in 1980 and 2000. So in the first step, we're just trying to divide the information. And here we got 2 graphs, 2 charts, making it pretty easy for us. We know that we're going to spend 2 body paragraphs describing the data, and we're going to spend 1 paragraph talking about the line graph and 1 paragraph just talking about the pie chart, right? So this is an important step, dividing the information in your mind, just dividing the information and planning how we are going to execute this task. And what this does is gives us another insight to what is it that we're actually going to be describing, right? So now we're ready for step 3 and actually describing the information. So we're going to, again, go back to the first chart. That's the first chart we're going to describe. And for all of our charts, we can see that the information may be quite complex, especially with line charts. The curves may be quite complicated and have many variations to them. But we have to remember that we are given 150 words and 20 minutes to describe these trends, and we're asked to summarize the information that we see. So instead of looking at this task like this, we may be thinking more like this, really just simplifying the overall trend, looking at the highs, looking at the lows, looking at the general trend overall, and try to summarize it. Let's take a look at an example here. Although the average expenditure on car maintenance decreases dramatically from around $350,000 in January to less than $100,000 in May, this figure stabilizes and remains constant until August, when the cost of repairing a vehicle increases significantly once again to $350,000 by December. Now, when we look at this sentence, the first thing that really is important for us to realize is we just summarized all of that information in one sentence. And we were able to do that by using 2 very helpful subordinations, although and when. We will talk more about although and when and how to join sentences in Module 1.2 of this Academic Writing Task 1 module. But we can see that this sentence is quite efficient in describing this trend. It's just one sentence, and it really combines effectively a description of the entire trend that we can see. We can see that we're also paraphrasing in many ways. We're not just repeating average expenditure on car maintenance, right? We're trying to, we can use that definitely, but we're paraphrasing as well. And again, one thing that's also important is the tenses, right? Maintenance costs decreases dramatically, right? It stabilizes, right? And this is important because this tense, this is simple present that we're using, and we know that we need to use simple present because in our second step, when we were dividing information, we identified that this is a reoccurring trend. This is a trend that happens, right, all the time, right? So we're using simple present, right? And so we can also notice that we're using adverbs like dramatically, significantly. We can use slowly, gradually to modify those verbs, right? We can modify those verbs. So we have just finished describing this entire trend, and we got another 49 words. So let's move on to our second chart. We have our pie chart. Now, whenever we're describing about pies and charts, it's important to remember proportions, right? So the only thing we need to remember is half, a quarter, and a third. And again, those are the only proportions that we need in order to score a perfect score in IELTS Task 1 Academic. We can use a little more than a third, less than a quarter, around a half, about half, more than half, less than a half, right? And this can help us summarize some of these trends and pieces of information. For example, in this chart, we can see that more than half of all repair costs are attributed to accidents. We can say more than a quarter of the repair cost for repairing an automobile comes from tires, and we can see there's an equal proportion. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example sentence. Although a little more than half of the maintenance costs for vehicles results from accidents, tires take up more than a quarter of the cost of repairing a vehicle, while the cost of lights, lubricants, and filtration make up an equal proportion of 5%. Again, we're using our lovely friends, the subordinations. Here we're using although and while. And we're joining all of that information. We're combining all of that information, not only by paraphrasing some of this data, but also combining it together in one sentence using those subordinations, right? So it's all about the efficient use of language when describing this data. And again, we have another 44 words, so now we're down to 120 words, so we only need 30 words more to complete this, so we're ready for a final step, which is to write the overview. The overview is important. You will need an overview for all academic writing tasks 1, including maps and charts, just to make you remember that. But anyway, it's time to write the overview, which comes at the end. The overview is not the same thing as a conclusion. Okay? Essays have conclusions. Descriptive tasks require an overview. An overview is a general identification of relationships between parts of the data or relationships between trends that we can see. And again, when we're looking at two charts like this, a good way to think about writing an overview is to see the relationship between these two trends, right? With an overview, we're not expected to describe everything, but have a holistic or general idea of what we're supposed to do. So with identifying relationships between the data, it's important to look at the lows, look at the highs, look at the main trends, right? And just see the relationship between these. Now, very big important point here, an overview does not include an opinion. In fact, for writing academic writing task 1, you are not allowed, you are not expected, you are definitely not expected to provide an opinion for this task. No opinions for writing task 1. All we really want is a descriptive overview of the trends that we can see. Just remembering that these graphs describe a North American town, so we don't know which North American town this is, if it's in Florida or if it's in Mexico City or if it's Calgary, right? So just looking at these trends, we can see that from November and February, from November all the way to February, that's where we get the most amount of repair costs or maintenance costs for automobiles, and we can see that accidents are the main source, we could be tempted to perhaps speculate that snowy conditions or weather conditions could affect this, but we don't know which North American town this is, so we cannot rely on conjecture or personal experience to be describing this information. We can only rely on what we see, what the numbers represent. Let's take a look at an example here. Overall, the highest cost of car maintenance in this North American town seems to occur during the winter season, while the opposite is true for the summer, and the majority of these costs result from accidents. Right? It's a general description of a comparison of both trends and the relationship between them. We have another 36 words. So, with everything together, we have 156 words, which is exactly what we need for a writing task 1. So, just to reiterate, this is the general method that we can use for describing and completing IELTS Academic Writing Task 1. Step 1, write the paraphrase. Focus on that paraphrase first. Ignore the charts, the graphs. They will only confuse you and make you waste valuable time. A paraphrase can be done immediately, right? You can just put your paper to pen or your fingers to your keys and write the sentence immediately and start producing something. It will also give you a clear understanding of what you're supposed to do. 2, divide the information. This is a mental task. This is a task that will allow you to plan how you're going to describe your information, but it will also give you insights about what the data is all about and what the data describes. Finally, describe the information. Make sure to use the correct tense and only to describe things you can see. Again, we're going to talk more about the actual grammar aspect in our second section. And finally, write an overview. Be aware that we're only expected to describe general trends. We are not expected, we're not supposed to add any of our opinions or personal experiences in this. This is not a conclusion, this is not an opinion, it's an overview. We're just trying to describe the general relationship between the data. All right, so that's the general method. See you in section 1.2.